she buried her husband on a Tuesday. By Friday, a letter arrived telling her she now owned land she'd never seen, in a town she'd never heard of, left to her by a brother she thought was dead. This is the story of a woman who went looking for a piece of paper and ended up finding out who she really was. Stay with me, because what she found waiting for her out there was not what anyone expected, not the town, not the land, and definitely not the man living on it. Her name was Margaret Coale. 29 years old, freshly widowed, with a trunk, a train ticket, and a lawyer's letter she'd read so many times the creases were starting to tear. The letter said her brother Daniel, who she hadn't seen in 11 years, who she'd been told died of fever out west, had actually been alive this whole time. And now he was dead for real, and he'd left her 60 acres of land outside a town called Bitter Rock. Margaret hadn't cried when her husband died. Grief had come and gone for him quietly, the way it does for a marriage that had long since gone cold. But when she read that her brother had been alive all those years and never once written to her, something cracked open in her chest that she didn't have a name for. Not sadness exactly. Something closer to fury, standing next to heartbreak, the two of them holding hands. She told herself she was going west to sign papers and sell the land. Get the money, come home, start over somewhere quiet. That was the plan. Plans, as you're about to see, have a way of falling apart the second they meet reality. The train ride took 4 days. Margaret spent most of it staring out the window at land that kept getting emptier and wilder, wondering what kind of man her brother had become out here, and why, in 11 years, he never once sent word that he was alive. She had 100 versions of him in her head by the time the train pulled into Bitter Rock, some angry, some forgiving, all of them incomplete, because the real answer was waiting for her in a place she hadn't even seen yet. Bitter Rock wasn't much. One main street, a general store, a saloon that looked older than the town itself, and dust that got into everything, including your mouth if you weren't careful. The lawyer who'd sent the letter, a nervous, sweating man named Otis Pruitt, met her at the station and looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't finished solving. "Mrs. Coale," he said, shaking her hand too hard. "I have to tell you, there's been a complication." Margaret had learned, in 29 years of living, that when someone starts a sentence with, "I have to tell you," you should sit down before they finish it. She didn't sit down. She just waited. The complication, it turned out, had a name. Caleb Reyes. And he was currently living on her land. Here's where the story gets interesting, so stay with me. Caleb Reyes wasn't a squatter. He wasn't some drifter who'd wandered onto empty land and decided to stay. He was her brother's business partner, had been, for the last 6 years, running cattle together on that 60 acres, building a life out of dirt and sweat and stubbornness. And according to Pruitt, Daniel had told Caleb, more than once, out loud, in front of witnesses, that the land would be his one day. A promise. Never put on paper. Never made official. Just words, spoken between two men who trusted each other enough not to think they needed a lawyer. Except Daniel died before he could make good on that promise, and instead the land went, by blood and by law, to a sister he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Now, if you were writing a simple story, this is where Caleb turns out to be a villain, someone scheming to steal what isn't his. That would be easy. That's not what happened. When Margaret rode out to the property the next morning, nervous, sweating through her traveling dress, half expecting a fight, she found a man mending a fence in the early light, moving like the work was second nature to him, like he'd done it 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more without complaint. He was maybe 35, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet that comes from spending years around cattle instead of people. When he saw her coming, he didn't reach for a gun and he didn't run. He just stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and waited for her to say whatever she'd come to say. "You're Daniel's sister," he said before she could speak. Not a question. He'd clearly been expecting her. "You're the man living on my land," she said back, and she watched something flicker across his face, not anger, something closer to tired resignation, like a man who'd already had this conversation with himself 100 times before she ever showed up. "It was going to be my land," he said. "Your brother and I built this place from nothing. Every fence post, every head of cattle, every inch of that barn. He told me it would be mine when something happened to him. I believed him." He looked at her steady, not backing down but not pushing either. "I understand that doesn't mean much to a judge." Margaret stood there in the dust with the sun coming up behind him, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She believed him. Every word. That's the thing about grief and inheritance, they force two strangers into the same small space and dare them to figure out who's telling the truth. Now, most people in Margaret's position would have gone straight back to town, sold the land to the highest bidder, and let the lawyers sort out whatever mess was left behind. She almost did exactly that. She told herself, riding back into Bitter Rock that first afternoon, that she didn't owe Caleb Reyes anything. She didn't know him. She didn't know her own brother, not really, not anymore. The smartest thing to do was cut her losses and go home. But that night, lying awake in the small room above the general store, she found herself thinking not about the land, but about her brother. About the fact that he'd built an entire life out here, a partner, cattle, a home, and never once wrote to tell her he was alive. She needed to know why. And the only person who could tell her was the man standing on her land, mending fences that might not even be his to mend much longer. So the next morning, she rode back out. Not to sell. To ask questions. This is where the story really starts moving, so don't go anywhere. Over the next 2 weeks, a strange kind of truce formed between them. Margaret didn't sign anything. Caleb didn't leave. Instead, she started coming out to the property most mornings, sitting on an overturned bucket near the barn, asking him question after question about her brother, what he was like, what he laughed at, whether he ever talked about home, about her. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture started forming of a man Margaret had never known. Daniel, it turned out, hadn't stayed silent all those years out of anger or forgetting. Caleb told her, carefully, like he was handling something fragile, that Daniel used to write letters. Dozens of them. Margaret's hands went cold hearing that. Letters he never sent. Caleb had found a whole box of them in the cabin after Daniel died, addressed to her, dated across years, and never mailed. Why? Margaret asked, and her voice cracked on the word in a way that embarrassed her. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He told me once he left home in shame. Something about money he owed your husband. Debts he couldn't pay. He said he figured you were better off thinking he was dead than knowing what kind of man he'd actually become. He looked at her carefully. I think the longer he waited, the harder it got to explain why he'd waited so long in the first place. Shame's got a way of building its own wall, brick by brick, till a man can't see over it anymore. Margaret sat with that for a long time. It didn't fix anything. It didn't bring her brother back or undo 11 years of silence. But it gave her something she desperately needed, a reason instead of a mystery. Grief is so much harder to carry when it comes with a question mark attached. That night, Caleb brought her the box of letters. 43 of them, unopened, tied together with twine gone brittle with age. Margaret sat by lamplight in that little room above the general store and read every single one, and by the end she understood her brother better through paper he never sent than she had through any memory of the boy she grew up with. Here's an interesting thing about grief nobody tells you: sometimes the person you're mourning isn't the one who died. Sometimes you're mourning the years you didn't get to have with them while they were still alive. Margaret spent that whole night mourning 11 years of letters that sat in a drawer instead of a mailbox, and by morning, something in her had shifted. She wasn't just a woman who'd inherited land anymore. She was a woman trying to finish something her brother never got to finish. And that meant one thing: she wasn't selling. Now, you'd think that decision alone would be the end of the story. Sister keeps land, partners with rancher, slow romance blooms under wide open skies, everybody's happy. And for about a week, that's almost exactly what happened. Margaret told Caleb she intended to keep the property, and instead of splitting it or fighting over paper, she offered him something her brother never got the chance to put in writing: an actual partnership, drawn up properly, with both their names on it. Caleb didn't say much when she offered it. He just looked at her for a long moment, nodded once, and said, "Your brother would have liked that a lot more than lawyers arguing over him." But Bitter Rock, it turns out, had its own plans for that land, and they had nothing to do with sentiment. About 10 days after Margaret decided to stay, a man named Wendell Ashcroft rode out to the property. Ashcroft owned the biggest spread in the county, ran more cattle than anyone, and had a reputation, according to the whispers Margaret picked up at the general store, for getting exactly what he wanted through means that weren't always what you'd call honest. He came out smiling, hat in hand, all charm on the surface, and offered to buy the land outright. "A generous price," he said. "More than fair," he said. Margaret said no. Ashcroft's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. He tipped his hat, said he understood, and rode away. And Margaret, who had grown up around men who smiled right before they did something ugly, felt a cold little seed of worry plant itself in her stomach. She was right to worry. 2 nights later, someone cut the fence along the north boundary and ran off a dozen head of cattle into the dark. Caleb found the damage at dawn, jaw tight, saying nothing, just working the fence line with his hands shaking slightly in a way Margaret had never seen from him before. She asked him straight out if he thought it was Ashcroft. "I know it was," Caleb said. "Man's done it before. To your brother, actually, 2 years back, right before Daniel suddenly decided he needed a loan and Ashcroft was awful quick to offer one." He looked at her. "That loan's part of why your brother never dug his way out of debt. Ashcroft's been circling this land for years. Your brother dying just gave him an opening he'd been waiting on." And there it was, the thing nobody had said out loud yet. Margaret's brother hadn't just died of an accident, which is what the official story said: a horse spooked, a fall, bad luck. Standing in that torn-up pasture with dawn coming up gray and cold, Margaret started to wonder if bad luck had had some help. This is the part of the story where everything Margaret thought she understood gets turned upside down, so stick with me. Margaret went back into town and did something she was good at, something her years as a quiet, overlooked wife had trained her for without her even realizing it. She started asking careful questions and paying close attention to who got nervous answering them. She talked to the town doctor, who admitted, reluctantly, that he'd never actually examined Daniel's body closely, because Ashcroft himself had been the one to bring the news and handle the arrangements, moving fast, paying for everything, discouraging anyone from making a fuss. She talked to the stable boy, who remembered Daniel's horse being found calm and unhurt 2 miles from where the body was, which didn't sit right with a story about a fall. And she talked to Otis Pruitt, the nervous lawyer, who it turned out had drawn up more paperwork for Wendell Ashcroft than he was entirely comfortable admitting, including, just days before Daniel's death, a document transferring a right-of-way straight through the middle of the Coale land that happened to sit directly between Ashcroft's ranch and the river that fed it. A right-of-way Daniel had refused to sign, over and over, for months. Suddenly a dead man's stubbornness looked a lot less like an accident and a lot more like a motive. Margaret rode back out to the ranch that evening and told Caleb everything. He listened without interrupting, jaw tightening more with every piece of it, and when she finished he sat back on the porch step and stared out at the darkening pasture for a long, long time. "I always thought it was strange," he finally said. "Daniel wasn't a careless rider. Best hand with a horse I ever knew." He looked at her. I didn't want to believe it because believing it meant I'd been living next door to the man who killed my partner for 2 years and shaking his hand every time he rode by smiling. They sat with that heavy silence between them, the kind that comes when two people realize they're standing at the edge of something much bigger and more dangerous than either of them planned for. Here's the thing about small towns and powerful men, proving what everybody quietly suspects is a whole different animal than just suspecting it. Margaret didn't have proof. She had a nervous lawyer, an unexamined body long since buried, and a right-of-way document that on its own proved nothing except that Daniel had said no to a deal. Suspicion doesn't hold up in front of a judge. She needed something solid, and she needed it fast, because the moment Ashcroft realized she was asking questions, the cattle rustling would be the least of her problems. She decided to try something bold. Instead of confronting Ashcroft, she invited him to the ranch for supper. Caleb thought she'd lost her mind. Man might have killed your brother, and you want to feed him biscuits? I want to watch his face, Margaret said, when I tell him I've decided to sign the right-of-way after all. It was a risk built on a simple piece of human nature. Guilty men relax the moment they think they've won, and relaxed men talk more than they should. Margaret had spent 11 years married to a man who thought her too quiet and too dull to notice much of anything, and in all that time, she'd learned exactly how to watch someone closely while they believed they weren't being watched at all. Ashcroft accepted the invitation eagerly, arriving with a bottle of good whiskey and that same easy, dangerous smile. Over supper, Margaret told him she'd thought it over, that fighting a man of his standing wasn't worth the trouble, that she'd sign the right-of-way in the morning if he'd just leave the rest of the property alone. Ashcroft's shoulders loosened. His smile turned genuine for the first time since Margaret had met him. And 2 glasses of whiskey in, with Caleb sitting quiet and tense across the table, Ashcroft made his first real mistake. Your brother should have just signed the first time I asked, he said, swirling his glass, more to himself than to either of them. Would have saved everybody a whole lot of trouble. Man was too proud for his own good. Ground didn't care how proud he was, though. Ground'll take anybody. The table went dead silent. Ashcroft seemed to hear his own words land a half-second late, and something shifted behind his eyes, the realization of a man who'd said too much to the wrong people. Margaret kept her face perfectly calm, the same calm she'd learned keeping a household together for a husband who never once noticed how sharp she actually was underneath all that quiet. That's an interesting way to put it, she said softly. Ground'll take anybody. Ashcroft's smile came back up fast, too fast, patched over the crack that had just shone through. He made some excuse about needing to get back before dark, and he left without finishing his whiskey, and the second his horse was out of earshot, Caleb turned to Margaret with something between fear and fury on his face. He as good as told us, Caleb said. He told us, Margaret said. Now we just need somebody else to hear it, too. That's where the stable boy came back into the story. Margaret went to him the next morning and asked if he'd be willing to say, in front of the sheriff and whoever else needed to hear it, exactly what he'd told her about Daniel's horse being found calm and unhurt, 2 miles from the body. He was scared. Everyone in Bitter Rock was scared of Ashcroft, for good reason, but Margaret sat with him a long while, told him about the letters her brother never sent, about 11 years of silence and shame, about how sometimes the only way to fix a wrong is somebody finally being brave enough to say the true thing out loud. The boy agreed. Then she went to Otis Pruitt, who was even more frightened, wringing his hands, talking himself in circles about ruined reputations and dangerous men. But Margaret reminded him, gently but firmly, that he'd been the one to draw up a right-of-way for land that wasn't his to give away, and that if this ever did go before a judge, it would look a whole lot better for him to be the man who came forward than the man who got dragged forward. Fear is a powerful thing, but so is the fear of being the last honest man standing in a room full of guilty ones. Pruitt agreed to talk too. 2 witnesses and a half-drunk confession weren't quite enough to hang a man, not out here, not against someone with Ashcroft's money and reach. But it was enough to get the attention of a federal marshal passing through the territory that same month. A stroke of luck Margaret would later call Providence, and Caleb would later call exactly the kind of thing that happens to people who finally stop being afraid and start asking the right questions of the right people. The marshal listened to the stable boy. He listened to Pruitt. He rode out and looked at where the body had actually been found, cross-referenced it against Ashcroft's own recent land acquisitions in the county. 3 other ranchers, it turned out, who'd sold out cheap and fast right around the time their cattle mysteriously started disappearing too. A pattern doesn't lie the way a single story can. And patterns, once a lawman starts looking for them, have a way of becoming impossible to unsee. Wendell Ashcroft was arrested 3 weeks later, not yet for murder. That would take longer, would take a trial and more evidence than a half-drunk comment over supper, but for fraud, for the falsified right-of-way, for enough to finally put him behind something other than his own front porch, and enough to make every rancher he'd bullied in that county suddenly find their courage all over again. Once one person came forward, 4 more did. The dam doesn't break slow. It breaks all at once, the second the first crack gets wide enough. Margaret stood outside the Little Bitter Rock jailhouse the day they brought him in and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the moment she read that first lawyer's letter back home. Not peace exactly. Something closer to completion. Her brother hadn't just fallen off a horse and been forgotten. Somebody had finally said his name out loud and made it matter. Here's the part of the story I think you'll want to hear most, so don't go anywhere yet. With Ashcroft gone and the truth finally sitting out in the open where everyone could see it, life on the ranch slowed down into something Margaret hadn't let herself imagine when she first stepped off that train. She and Caleb ran the property together, the way her brother had always meant it to be run, 2 names on the paper instead of 1, 2 sets of hands instead of a fight over which set mattered more. They worked the same fences, side by side, mornings turning into afternoons turning into the kind of comfortable quiet that only happens between 2 people who've stopped performing for each other and started just existing together. It wasn't dramatic, the way it happened between them. There was no single big moment, no speech, no grand declaration. It was smaller than that, and somehow bigger too. It was Caleb noticing, without being asked, that Margaret took her coffee a certain way and starting to make it that way every morning without a word. It was Margaret staying up late repairing a torn shirt of his because her hands needed something to do and his hands were too tired from the day to do it themselves. It was the 2 of them sitting on that same porch step where Ashcroft had once said too much, watching the sun go down together, not talking, not needing to. One evening, months after all the dust of that first year had settled, Margaret asked Caleb something that had been sitting quietly in the back of her mind since the very first morning she rode out and found him mending that fence. "Why didn't you fight me on the land?" she asked, that first day. "You could have. Plenty of men would have." Caleb thought about it a long moment, the way he thought about most things, slow and careful, like every word had a weight he wanted to get right. "Your brother used to talk about you," he said. "More than you'd think, for a man who never mailed a single letter. He said you were the smartest person he ever knew and the most stubborn, and that you deserved a whole lot better than what life handed you." He looked over at her. "I figured if his sister showed up half as sharp and half as stubborn as he described, fighting her over a piece of land would be about the dumbest thing I ever did." He paused. "Turned out I was right. About the stubborn part, anyway. The sharp part, I underestimated." Margaret laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her a little coming out, because it had been a long time since anything had pulled a laugh like that out of her chest. They were married the following spring, out on the north pasture, under the same wide sky that had swallowed up so much grief and so much truth over the past year. Otis Pruitt drew up the papers himself, hands not shaking near as much as they used to. The stable boy stood in the back, grinning ear to ear like he'd personally arranged the whole thing. And somewhere in a drawer back in the ranch house, 43 unsent letters sat tied together with fresh twine, kept not as a wound anymore, but as a reminder, proof that even silence, even shame, even 11 wasted years, can still lead somebody home in the end, if they're brave enough to finally go looking. Margaret Coale came west with a lawyer's letter and a plan to sell a piece of land she'd never seen. She left with a husband, a partner, a ranch, and the truth about a brother she'd spent 11 years believing she'd already lost twice over. Sometimes the thing you go looking for isn't the thing you actually find. Sometimes you have to lose the plan completely before life hands you something real. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do isn't fighting for what's owed to them, it's staying long enough, and asking enough hard questions, to find out what's actually true. If this story stuck with you, you already know what kind I mean when I say I've got more just like it. Stay close, because the next one might just be the one that surprises you even more.